Dark Souls 2 isn't Dark Souls 1. It shares a lot of the broader strokes and some things that are basically unchanged, even down to its name and story, but it differs in the finer details, which is what matters if you're expecting to find more Dark Souls. But the game being different isn't necessarily a bad thing either. Sure, it has some rather questionable ideas, and it also suffers in execution in places, but it makes up for it with a huge increase in content, complexity and difficulty, which extends the life of the game by allowing you to explore mechanics, builds and areas initially too difficult to take on. While a more focused design and interconnected experience like Dark Souls 1 is appreciated, Dark Souls 2's more laid back and loose approach to design also has its appeals. That's not to say the game is casual. On your first playthrough you are sure to get your face kicked in, with some enemy encounters not even allowing a single slip up without turning you into cottage cheese. On subsequent playthroughs, however, there's plenty of room to explore some of the game's better ideas. One of the first and better mechanics I tried out the second time around is the power stance ability, which is bad and good for exactly the same reason. It's complicated. Get this, in order to power stance, you need to first figure out the weapons you want to power stance are compatible with each other and if there are any exceptions. Then you need to have 1.5 times the amount of strength and dexterity and the highest requirement of either weapon rounded down and to merely meet the minimum requirement for the other stats, if applicable. Then you should figure out where the weapon types of your weapon lies in the hierarchy of movesets, if they are in the same tier, which moveset you would like to use, putting the weapon associated with that moveset in your dominant hand. Finally, hold Y. While it took a fair while to research how the mechanic works, it pales in comparison to the amount of time spent on exploring all the interesting combinations possible, and there are a lot of viable builds and weapons, partly thanks to the new infusion system. The infusion system functions like the upgrade path in Dark Souls 1, in that it changes how your weapon scales and deals damage, but it can also be used with shields to make them more defensive against that element. It's also introduced some new options: bleed, poison, mundane and dark. Bleed is, of course, intended to fuck with people that don't do their research, poison is for infusing with reckless rapier, and mundane for people that hate making choices and don't read the patch notes. While the fire infusion isn't new, the way fire damage scales is as that now scales with both your intelligence and faith equally. Dark damage scales comparably, but instead scales with the lowest of your faith and intelligence. It's also something that goes hand in hand with hexes, which is also based on dark damage as well. Unlike in Dark Souls 1, where dark and hexes was something merely tacked onto the DLC with one catalyst with special synergy and an item that could deflect it, in Dark Souls 2 it's implemented into the base game. There's the above mentioned infusion, the fact that hexes require both faith and intelligence to cast. There's some hexes that require chimes and others that require a staff, depending on which requirements is higher. Certain hexes eat souls for more power, and there's a covenant dedicated to dark, and some items to spice it up even further. This means there is a lot of interesting things to experiment with once you've really gotten into the game. But while most of what I've said so far might make the game seem like it's strictly better than its predecessor, Dark Souls 2 certainly has its flaws. There's the questionable ideas I mentioned earlier. An example of such would be the reduction of maximum health every time you die or get cursed, as well as the more severe penalty when you get petrified. And petrification in this is essentially what curse was in the last game, except instead of being locked to half health until you use a very rare item, you only lose 20% health and can easily go back to full health for an item the game eventually showers you in. And while that system might make sense in terms of lore, it's a terrible and counterintuitive gameplay mechanic. There's also no advanced tutorial, not even an optional one, which pretty much guarantees that only the most determined new players will become part of the player base. This means that interest in the game dies off a lot quicker, not that the awful online lag is helping either, but what can you expect when the only online setting is with or without Japanese players? Another questionable idea is the adaptability stat. Investing points in this gives various benefits, but more importantly is the extra invisibility frames while rolling. So if you want to be doing any kind of melee combat, you pretty much have to invest a fair amount of points in this. And if you don't, then why are you playing Dark Souls? Go back to Skyrim, you dang stealth archer. But if you are refusing to leave your comfort zone, you'll be happy to know that you can now aim with crossbows, although actually hitting your mark might prove difficult due to the god-awful collision meshes. If I had a fading soul for every time an arrow got stuck in the terrain, I could probably afford to buy back all my wasted ammo. On a similar note, the hitboxes in this game is all over the place. You can't reliably sidestep or swing or grab attacks, so rolling, or range combat, you wuss, straight up required in some situations, especially when fighting stomping bosses, and this is why the adaptability stat is such a bad idea. In order to roll with a reasonable amount of iframes, you need to invest in adaptability. In order to invest, you need to actually have enough souls, which you won't get until later. Seriously, what do you have against new players, from? But anyway, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason as to how enemies aggro in this game. Some enemies are triggered by other enemies' death, and other enemies aggro based on where you go, despite having no direct line of sight of you. This usually results in having to fight multiple enemies at once, which makes the combat feel more like you're doing crowd control rather than environmental puzzle solving. But if that's something you're not very good at, then you might be relieved to know that enemies eventually stop respawning, or you might be annoyed that you won't get any better at it. Getting into nitpicky and slightly spoilery territory now, Dark Souls 2 has taken quite a hit in terms of subtlety. For example, did you know that Sweet Trollcore is a cat? If not, then don't worry, she will browbeat that shit in with a teaspoon.
Oh, undead are we? And one without much time remaining. Just about ready to fall apart, I'd say. Not exactly the time to be chatting with a cat. It's enough to keep even a cat amused. But what does a cat know? Because I'm a cat?
It's also taken quite a hit in terms of quality.
You see that blacksmith over there? Is he one of those hollows? He seems to keep eyeing me up. He sort of looks like my father. He's a blacksmith too, you see.
Just talk to the freaking guy! Lastly, Dark Souls 2 has taken quite a few liberties with the lore, while also being extremely confusing about it. For example, there is this one boss you fight quite far into the game, the Duke's Stair Freya. This boss drops her own soul upon defeat, but she also guards one of the 4 great souls. On the second playthrough, however, she drops the old Pale Drake soul, which is strongly implied to be Seath's soul. Now, this does make sense primarily for 2 reasons. Firstly, no dragons in Dark Souls 1 had a soul, with the arguable exception being Priscilla. Secondly, Seath's soul in Dark Souls 1 is actually merely a fragment of Gwyn's soul, and while I could respect that the fragment somehow remains separate and with its own identity, I can't overlook the fact that nowhere in Dark Souls 2 is the Four Kings soul fragmented found nor mentioned. And this is just one of many examples. There's also the giant that looks nothing like the giants in Dark Souls 1, although that may or may not be more of an issue with the translation, and it may or may not be from playing fast and loose with what constitutes a giant. But let's stop harping on the game and focus on the positives instead. Dark Souls 2 is a very good looking game. No, actually that's an understatement. Dark Souls 2 is one of the best looking games I have ever seen, with damn near every area filling me with awe. While the transition between areas make little to no sense, making the world as a whole feel less cohesive, every individual area is beautiful and imaginative and makes sense in its own right. But the beauty of Dark Souls 2 is not just in the environment, but in the shading, animations, characters and items as well. There's nothing and no one that looks jarringly out of place, and even the sillier weapons and armor still make sense in some way. Dark Souls 2 also has one of, if not the best character creations I've ever come across. It's ridiculously flexible, so you can create anything from a grumpy rogue redhead to a cheerful brunette adventurer, a black guy, or even something else entirely. It is true that it's more difficult to create a black-looking black person than to beat Fume Knight with a Guitar Hero controller. It is also true that under the wrong lighting you look like a beat-up clown, but if you can look past this, you'll thoroughly appreciate Dark Souls 2's graphics. You likely won't see the fruits of your labor while being rotten beef jerky or while covered in armor, but it's a nice incentive to know that there's a good-looking character underneath all your Oh, and if you feel like changing your things betwixt mid-playthrough, you can do that. But unless you call your character something like Kim, it's gonna be awkward for someone. Unfortunately, it doesn't swap your gender too well, so if you were a woman, you will look effeminate, and if you were a man, then you look... The way durability works in this game is interesting in that everything has relatively low durability, but also automatically resets at bonfires unless broken. This turns durability into a real factor when judging whether or not a weapon or armor is viable for intended use, unlike in Dark Souls 1 where repairs were something done willy-nilly. Rings also have durability, and they don't disappear when broken either, which is nice. What is also nice is that the game encourages you to challenge yourself with items like the bonfire aesthetic that turns area connected to the bonfire up to the next playthrough difficulty. It's also content exclusive to higher difficulties, so setting it up is not just for the hardcore players. There's also a covenant exclusively dedicated to making the game more challenging, and progressing far enough in this covenant will give a ring that enhances the most fearsome weapons in the entire game. Right, that's all the major points worth talking about, so let me rattle off the rest of the points worth mentioning. The game is split between X versions that may or may not be able to play together, where X is whatever this chart is saying. I honestly cannot tell. What I can tell, however, is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of players in the version I'm playing, and that looking stuff up on the wikis is hella confusing sometimes. Every time you want to level up, you have to go to this Pokemon called Berserksik list. Hacking off extremities never gave good rewards. I mean, honestly, would it be too much to ask for the last giant to drop a Zweihander when disarming him? I'm fairly certain he has one stuck in there. It's introduced a fair amount of loose ends in the lore, where the most egregious examples of this is this one ring that mentions 10 different gods, some of which flies in the face of Dark Souls 1's lore, and even one that contradicts both Dark Souls 2 and itself, impressively enough. There's a bothersome inattention to detail, in that you can acquire the soul of a boss twice, and of course the above mentioned example. The positive. There's this cool mechanic where you have to rely on enemies' attacks, actions, and souls in order to gain access to new areas. There's indications where there is most online activity for your soul level. You can lock onto various body parts of bosses and some enemies. Ranged enemies try to predict your path and will aim accordingly. You can respec all your points into something completely different, so you're never stuck with a boring, terrible, or terribly boring build. You can efficiently sell duplicate and shite items to certain merchant, although there is no way to break down ore, so you have this weird situation where chunks are more valuable than slabs. There's certain shields that let you parry spells, however the spells isn't returned to sender, so you're better off dodging or blocking. And lastly, Torch Bro. Treat him well and you have a good time the first time you meet him, not so much a second.
Do not produce light.
And that about wraps it up. You may notice I didn't mention the soul memory or PvP that much. I simply haven't tried it enough to say that much about it, but to my understanding, the game supposedly has the best PvP in the trilogy. I haven't tried Dark Souls 3 either, which is why I didn't make any comparison to that game. So there. I might have given the impression I preferred Dark Souls 1, but honestly, Dark Souls 2 is just so replayable, I can't seem to grow tired of it. But I was writing this review, I've played through the game 4 times for nearly 300 hours, and it also has some really good DLC where a lot of items can be found. I recommend it, alright? Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm about to continue my 5th adventure as this handsome Latina. Oh, for